Settling the Great Plains, 1850 to 1930, problems or prospects and problems. So sort of the highlights and sort of the problems, barriers to settlement. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this region that we call the Great Plains. People frequently confuse the plains for the Middle West. And so when I say the Great Plains, I'm not talking really about Iowa. For the most part, I'm not talking at all about Iowa, but some people define the Great Plains in various ways. There are hundreds of different definitions of the Great Plains. Now, the Great Plains is easy to define on one side of the region. What side? Left or right? East or west? North or south? Which region? Take a wild guess. 25% chance here. North, south, east, or west? Which boundary of the Great Plains is easy to define? Online people? What do you say?
The western side.
What?
The western side.
The western side is easy to define because why?
The Rocky Mountains.
Because the Rocky Mountains, the front range of the Rocky Mountains pretty much defines the western boundary of the Great Plains. On the eastern boundary of the Great Plains, on the other hand, it's a little more ambiguous. Okay, if you know Oklahoma, then you know that the boundary here kind of skirts around the Ozarks and then the Ouachitas, right? Well, you know, there are a lot of ways to define the Great Plains. Some people have defined it based on things like lines of longitude, particularly the 98th meridian, which is about right here, or the 100th meridian, which is a little farther west. Now, the farther west this eastern boundary is, defined, what happens as we push the boundary west? What happens to the environment? It doesn't necessarily get flatter. It's actually really, it's really flat up here. But what happens is the climate gets drier, right? So the amount of rainfall that's received on an annual basis pretty much declines from east to west across the Great Plains. So definitions of the eastern boundary of the Great Plains are quite ambiguous and maybe disputed. People worry about that kind of thing. In this case, we've got a boundary that is, what I've tried to do here is try to give you a boundary that is very generous for the Great Plains, right? And look north of the Canadian boundary. What do the Canadians refer to that region as? Anybody know? North of the U.S. International boundary, this part of the Great Plains is referred to as the Prairie Provinces, right? So if you hear Canadians referring to the Prairie Provinces, they're talking usually about Saskatchewan and Alberta and probably Manitoba. So those are the Prairie Provinces. But we consider it all one region, and you could even perhaps push the region into Mexico a little bit. On the other hand, physiographers, physical geographers, geomorphologists, actually have a fairly rigid definition of the Great Plains. These are people that study landforms, people in both geography and geology, who study how landforms develop. They, for the most part, usually exclude most of Oklahoma, and you'll see that there's an area here that you may have heard about in Oklahoma called the High Plains of the Panhandle. But these are more or less physiographic components of the Great Plains that have resulted from the denudation or the degradation of the Rocky Mountains. Now, which way do rivers flow, for the most part, in the Great Plains region? Which direction do rivers flow? From the Rocky Mountains toward the Mississippi, right? Toward the Mississippi drainage. For the most part, those rivers are crossing, the rivers are fed by mountain snowmelt and maybe also aquifers and that sort of thing. and then periodically by thunderstorms and ice storms like we have today. So the rivers that flow across the Great Plains generally flow, generally from west to east. And of course, a big exception perhaps is the Missouri River that crosses around Kansas City to St. Louis here. The Missouri River kind of cuts right through the middle of the region, and much of the northern Central Plains are within the Missouri River drainage basin. Down in the southern part of the Great Plains, much of the rivers are actually parallel right out of the Rocky Mountains into the Mississippi system south of the Missouri River. So big rivers like the Arkansas River, right? Now, in Oklahoma, we say the Arkansas River, but if you were in Kansas or Colorado, what would the name of that river be? Okay, maybe you've ever been to Kansas City, Kansas? So it's, anyway, place names, Arkansas River or Arkansas River. In Oklahoma, we've got a number of, east-west flowing, more or less west-east flowing rivers, sorry. The Arkansas, what else? What are some other rivers that flow across the state of Oklahoma?
Salt Fork. Or is that Florida, the Arkansas?
The Salt Fork of the Arkansas is a fork, yeah, okay. How about the southern boundary of Oklahoma? The Red River, okay, and there's also, there are forks of the of the Red River. How about in between the Red and the Arkansas, what do we have? How about the one just south of us from Stillwater, down near Perkins? Makes up a boundary of part of Payne County, but probably not all of you are from this area. The Cimarron, right? Cimarron River. They used to call Oklahoma State, the Princeton on the Prairie or the Yale on the Cimarron. Anyway, this is the Cimarron River, and then we have the North, what's referred to as the North Canadian River. I'm not saying these in order, but the North Canadian River is actually in the Panhandle referred to as Beaver Creek. And then the Canadian River, not the South Canadian River, but just the Canadian River, flows kind of right through the middle part of the state. We also have other rivers like the Deep Fork, but for the most part, these are big rivers that flow through a fairly dry region, and over time, most of the water in their streams or in their channels flow through the stream bed. So we get a lot of streams that are kind of classified as braided streams, as there's actually more sand than water in the stream, and a lot of that water that flows through the stream actually flows underneath the surface in the sand. Sometimes we might even refer to these types of streams as exotic streams. That is, a river that flows from a place where it has a lot of source water across a relatively dry area where it's mostly losing water through evaporation, and then finally hits into the more humid areas. All right, so the Great Plains are a real distinctive region. A lot of people that have never had the great fortune of traveling in the Great Plains, only flying over it, can't appreciate the Great Plains. All right? The Great Plains is anything but flat. All right? Sure, there are really flat areas of the Great Plains. What are some really flat parts of the plains? The high plains tend to be fairly level, not flat, but level, very, very level. But there are many parts of the Great Plains that are actually very, very hilly, like this area in the middle part of Nebraska. Okay, so now's when you need to pull out that big map that you ordered from online, the race map, and look at the central part of Nebraska. Okay, that's covered by a region that's called what? Think of a bird, all right? Think of a really big bird, a crane, a type of crane, not a whooping crane, but looks a lot like a whooping crane. A sandhill crane, exactly. The sandhills are right through here, the sandhills. It's a huge region of stabilized sand dunes. Those are sand dunes that are covered largely with medium and tall grasses. And it's really distinctive agriculturally because it's no good for growing crops, except for maybe some center pivot agriculture in some of the river valleys and that sort of thing. But for the most part, the sand hills of Nebraska are fantastic cattle raising country, fantastic ranching country. Some of these huge ranches that you'll find in the Great Plains are in the sand hills. They're really, I say, good for ranching because even though it's sandy, there's lots of tall grass, and interspersed in the lower parts of the hills, or the little valleys of the hills, you often get spring-fed ponds, spring-fed small lakes that provide plenty of water. This is an area where a gigantic aquifer that stretches really from southern South Dakota all the way down into the area around Midland, Odessa, Texas. This whole region is largely the area that we refer to as the High Plains Aquifer, or the Ogallala Aquifer. And the Ogallala Aquifer is one of the world's largest sources of fresh water below the surface that's accessible by people at the surface. So the Ogallala Aquifer is the key to modern-day agriculture in the region. It's not so important for the period that we're going to be looking at, which is, for the most part, up from about 1850 up until about the time of the Great Depression. So up till about the 1930s. But after World War II, the southern plains began to be, the High Plains Aquifer began to be tapped by agricultural folks, and you have a transformation of agriculture in the Texas and Oklahoma panhandles, eastern Colorado, and southwestern Kansas. All right. Well, I'm going to move on here a little bit. We're going to talk more about the plains and sort of definitions here, some more definitions for you. And this is, kind of just a basic definition. Recognize the prairie provinces here, easy definition here, kind of a fudge definition there. Here are some counties that are considered plains counties. So here in Payne County, we're located right there. I would have to agree. I don't really think Payne County is much of a Great Plains area, but you don't have to go very far to get into the plains. Start driving west across the top of Logan County into Kingfisher County and perhaps Blaine County. Once you're in Blaine County, there's no question you're on the plains, okay? At least in my point of view. So western Oklahoma, for the most part, definitely plains. And the Great Plains is certainly not, eastern Oklahoma is certainly not. Y'all have opinions about this? This is your particular chapter author's definition of the Great Plains. His biggest work was the Encyclopedia of the Great Plains, which, if you have a chance, you can get online and check it out. I might link it. Actually, it's provided online for free. But this region is what he defined as the eastern boundary of the plains, and it was largely a matter of sort of being pragmatic to include a lot of the state's history that could be associated with plains. So Oklahoma kind of gets got off. Texas and Oklahoma kind of get pushed to the edge there. Now, if we look at population, the population of the Great Plains for most of the 20th century experienced decline. All right? Now today, in 2018, population is changing quite a bit on the Great Plains. We don't need to talk too much about recent changes, but there are actually places that are being repopulated where the population is growing for the first time in, say, 70 or 80 years because of mostly migration of people into different areas for jobs, as usual. This is a kind of a map that shows you just sort of the population density relatively, recently. And what you might notice is that there are, you can't read this map that great, but population densities are, for the most part, in the east, along the eastern margin, right? Eastern margin of the plains. In Oklahoma, most of the state's population is found in the sort of a line that runs from the northeast to the southwest, and maybe down in the south central part a little bit. But once you get into the central part of the Great Plains, this is where you have a lot of relatively empty counties, big, wide open spaces. And then along the Rocky Mountain Front Range, you have some of the higher densities again, particularly in Colorado, where you have, of course, big urban areas. But a writer by the name of Ian Fraser, you might be familiar with him, he's a pretty well-known contributor to the New Yorker magazine, and he's written quite a few popular books. My favorite's this one, just Great Plains, and he has some fantastic lines in it, but one of them is, just describes the Great Plains as a place where agriculture stops and does a double take. In other words, this is a place where agriculture, if you think of, the Frederick Jackson Turner Manifest Destiny marching westward across the continent sort of agriculture, when agriculture got to the Great Plains, the story is that agriculture or farmers experienced for the first time some real different conditions, mostly associated with the lack of timber, the lack of building supplies, trees, forests, and a very precarious climate, one that was very unreliable in terms of precipitation and very finicky or very unpredictable in terms of violence. Right? So it's a region that perhaps, according to some, agriculture was challenged, and agriculture would eventually have to adapt. Right? I'll explain a little bit what I mean, a little bit more what I mean in a little bit. All right, well, like I said, how appropriate today. The Great Plains, environmentally, is one of the more hazardous parts of the world. And by hazard, I'm referring to natural hazards or environmental hazards as we study them in geography. That would include things like big extremes in temperature change. You don't have, there aren't that many other places in the world other than Siberia that have dramatic temperature fluctuations in really short amounts of time. Certainly for North America, it's the most extreme. It's the area where tornadoes have focused historically, as far as we know. Over the last 150 years, tornadoes tend to focus on the area that we call the Southern Plains, Tornado Valley. Blizzards. Blizzards are snowstorms, but also a combination of windstorms and snowstorms that can be very, very dangerous, particularly to people who are traveling in cars and get lost in what are called whiteouts. This is also a particular problem prior to automobiles, as you can imagine. Hailstorms. We don't think too much of hailstorms being in terms of danger to humans, but hailstorms and ice storms like this that we're in today, February 20th. Is that what it is today? February 20th. Ice storms and hailstorms cause huge amounts of disruption to electrical power grids. Hailstorms particularly cause cause enormous amounts of monetary damage to roofs, to automobiles, and keep insurance rates high. Right? So high winds, and actually the natural hazard that has probably caused the most problems over the long term would be drought. The Great Plains, in fact, goes through cycles of droughts. And those cycles are sometimes defined as 20-year cycles. More recently, there's probably more of a consensus on an 11-year cycle of drought in the Great Plains. But it's a region that undergoes all sorts of natural hazards, but drought is one that has been very persistent and cyclical. If we look at historical records of drought in the Great Plains, we can identify a drought in the 1890s. In fact, this part of Oklahoma, here in Payne County, we were in Oklahoma territory, right? The unassigned lands, which was part of Oklahoma territory. Unassigned lands were opened up in 1889. Settlers ran in. Remember what was the day? April 22nd, 1889 was when mostly people from Kansas and Missouri and Kentucky and even Iowa and farther afield, Midwest, flooded into this part of the state. April 22nd, 1889. And it was only about a year later, less than a year later, that a major drought appeared. And by 1892, a lot of the people who had made the run into 1889 had already given up because it was so difficult to get a crop in with this drought. And I think it was about 1896, is when the rains returned. So it was a pretty hard, long drought, but we don't have a huge amount of records about that drought. Of course, the most famous drought in Great Plains history is that of the 1930s, the Dirty 30s. And the drought of the 1930s led to much of the Southern Plains becoming known as, thanks to a lot of the published propaganda on it, the Dust Bowl, right? And the people who were forced out of an area of the central Southern Plains became, and many of them who went to California, became known as Okies, right? Even though probably the majority of them weren't from Oklahoma. The majority of them were probably from Texas. But Texans, Oklahomans, people from northeastern New Mexico, southwest Kansas, southeast Colorado, a lot of them actually did leave. Up to, in some counties, up to 25% of the population, which you might say, well, 25% of the population, heck, 25% of the class drops class. Not necessarily. But, it is a pretty big chunk. Okay? But certainly a lot more people stayed than left. In fact, a lot of those people that wound up in California in the mid-1930s that became known as Okies, probably, a lot of them were from Oklahoma, but they weren't from the drought-stricken part of Oklahoma. A lot of them came from southern and eastern Oklahoma, where agriculture had been in a depression for more than a decade already. That's a little bit of a different story. A lot of the Okies were from Arkansas and from other states in the southern, in the Cotton Belt that was experiencing major economic upheaval since the early 1920s. Anyway, all right, and then there was in the after the Dust Bowl days, it wasn't long until the mid-1950s, there was another drought. In fact, the drought of the middle 1950s, from about 1954-55 to about 1958, was even more severe than that over the 1930s. The heat waves were incredible at that time. But it didn't lead to massive agricultural disaster in the form of dust storms and massive consequences in places like Cimarron County and Texas County, Oklahoma. And of course, since the 1950s. We just went through, there's actually been 2 other droughts, but there was one in the 80s, and then the most recent drought in the Great Plains in Oklahoma was really severe. It began around 2008, 2009, okay, generally about 2009, and lasted all the way through about 2014. Okay? So it was the last drought that we were through was pretty awful. So, in terms of devastation, economic devastation, 1930s for sure, and a lot of this had to do because the drought hit right as something was happening economically to agriculture in the Southern Plains, and that big change was mechanization of agriculture. What do we mean by that? What is the mechanization of agriculture? I don't have my poker chips with me. Get the poker chips out. We'll talk for chips. And I haven't added in the bonus stuff, so. Okay, so. What is agricultural mechanization in a very general sense? Mechanics, replacing human and animal power with machine power, right? So mechanization, especially, and mechanization sure has been going on for a long time, but there was a real quick surge in mechanization after the early 20th century. We might think of mechanization in things like transportation, transport. In 1914, I believe it was, is when Henry Ford released the Model T, Ford Model T. And it was an instant hit, mostly among farmers, rural people in the United States. The Model T was manufactured, in such a rapid way, and it was so easy to fix and no nonsense that it was very, very. I think it was the most popular car ever, if I'm not mistaken, because they didn't stop manufacturing until something like the late 20s. Anyway, so you think of mechanization, you think of changing over from riding horses to riding automobile. Well, that mass production of automobiles was led to, in fact, the mass production of the gasoline engine. Right? Mass production of the gasoline engine made a sort of a fairly rapid transition to tractors. Now, tractors had been around since the late 1800s, but there was one big difference between tractors before Henry Ford and after Henry Ford. What was it? Exactly, thanks. Oh, I got you to say something. Okay, so steam power. Tractors had steam engines on them. Can you imagine driving a car using steam power today? It wouldn't go very fast. It would be very, very heavy. Try getting the thing out in the field, it would sink. So it was the lightweight internal combustion gasoline engine, okay? Gasoline engines that allowed tractors to suddenly get lighter and to use rubber tires, like a car. Okay? Rubber tires. That was a new one. So rubber tires on small gasoline engine tractors made a very inexpensive form of mechanized farming, or a mechanized tractor, affordable to farmers. Okay? So not too long after the Model T, we're talking generally in the 1920s, is when you have the emergence of the first small gasoline-powered rubber-tired tractors that farmers could, for the most part, afford if they had some cash. All right. The problem was, in Oklahoma, agriculture was doing great. It was fantastic in the time from about statehood, generally about 1907 till about 1919. Agriculture was fantastic. Lots of farmers did really well in that period. But then, and one of the reasons they did so well, especially wheat farmers, was that during about 1914 to about 1919, there was a huge world market for agricultural products produced in Oklahoma and the Southern Plains. What was it? Winter wheat, yeah. So the winter wheat belt expanded prior to that period, and really, expanded greatly during the 19-teens. Well, what's going on in the world between 1914 and about 1918, World War I? So how did that make sense to draw? How did that relate to Oklahoma farmers? Richard, you're giving me like pieces here. You've made one chip there, so you keep going now. So Oklahoma farmers, right, are producing wheat, and they need bread in the United Kingdom and in France because everybody's at war, right? And the allies that were neutral. We were neutral until about 1916, supposedly. But we were sending lots of wheat and other things to the allies, including Russia. Russia was an ally, right? So World War I allows Oklahoma farmers to do really well. But after World War I, at the end of World War I, Europe went back to work. They started rebuilding. Okay? And the price of agricultural commodities, cotton, wheat, corn, okay, these things that we were exporting, suddenly the price dropped out because there was a surplus. We were producing huge amounts, but all of a sudden there really wasn't much of a market for it. After 1919, you have Europe beginning to become productive again, and American farmers are in a position where, okay, we're getting less of a return on our crops, so the only thing we can kind of do is expand the number of acres that we have in order to kind of recover what we owe the bank. So the 1920s continued to be a time, for the most part, of expansion in some crops like wheat. Cotton, on the other hand, began to die off. And so the 1920s saw declining commodity prices. It was what a lot of historians call, the beginning of the Depression for agriculture in the United States. So the 1920s, just say, roughly speaking, the 1920s were a time of agricultural downturn in terms of the productivity, in terms of the profitability of agriculture. Okay? Then, as I've said, so in other words, farmers don't have a lot of cash to spend on mechanization, right? By 1930, after the stock market crash, there's no credit. So farmers in Oklahoma had been, of course, they hadn't had access really to many tractors unless they were doing very, very well in certain parts of the state, as in the Panhandle, okay, where they actually did have a lot of tractors. But most of the rest of the state of Oklahoma didn't have very many tractors. Your neighbor might have a tractor, and he might be able to help out 4 or 5 other farmers. Okay? So not everybody had to own a tractor to use a tractor, but up in the Panhandle, where farms were much larger and more successful, and they generally have mechanized agriculture. And so by the time the Depression hit and the drought hit, the Panhandle agriculturalists were plowing things up big time. They were engaged in what would become, for the most part, a pretty big disaster of soil loss. All right, so that's what I meant by overcultivation and drought. I mentioned the more severe 1950s drought. That's all we really need to know, except that had it, we can probably say that had it not been for those New Deal programs that were, usually hated during the late 1930s, as well as changes put in place afterward for irrigation and to prevent soil erosion. A lot of those things, the drought of the 1950s may have been much worse. So it's possible we were able to avoid a drought because of changes that were in response to the 1930s. But that's one of those things, that's one of those big questions that historians and agricultural historians and historical geographers like to ask, okay? So anyway, if we look at things like the annual precipitation rates or totals of the Great Plains, often it doesn't look much different than other parts of the world. But the problem is precipitation rates vary dramatically from year to year. So you can look at the mean, the average of precipitation in a location over 100 years. But what you should be looking at, perhaps, is the standard deviation from that mean. The standard deviations for drought, for precipitation are quite large in the Great Plains. All right, so with reference to drought, with regard to drought, we've got, for the most part, higher frequency of drought in the higher plains, that is, the farther west you go in the Great Plains. The high plains being one of the most westernmost parts of the region, where you have lower annual rates of precipitation, you also have the highest variability in precipitation. So as you go west, not only does the supply of rainfall drop or decline, it also gets more variable. It gets less reliable. And we might also say that the eastern plains, because of higher numbers of people, higher population densities, and slightly different types of agriculture, might be more affected by that. Anyway, okay. You're going to read about the Pawnee and up in Nebraska, and the story concludes for the most part with their removal to our part of the state, north central Oklahoma, around Black Bear Creek, just up to our northeast here in Pawnee County. And that was around the middle 1870s. And but the story that you're going to read is about what happened between the time that American settlers and explorers started coming into their region and that period. So how does how do the Pawnee, how are they affected by changes that are taking place around them? Changes not just with the white settlers coming in, but also their enemies, like the Lakota to the north of them, becoming more and more powerful. How are they affected by that? How are they affected by population affecting diseases and that sort of thing that are introduced? So these are the things that are discussed in that paper. One of the issues also is, and this is discussed in your chapter, your text chapter, and that's this term dispossession, specifically compensation. Or, how is the land? We all know that Native Americans, tribes, for the most part, lost a lot of land throughout the 19th century. It wasn't necessarily through the same methods that other imperial powers used, like, say, the Spanish and the Portuguese, where they conquered peoples. In the case of the American expansion, we have a set of treaties. We have a process of making treaties, and that treaty process tended to, for the most part, erode the system. And then, so there are a lot of other facets of this issue that we call dispossession over time. In the case of, you'll see with the Pawnee, you'll read about how the federal government paid the tribe for certain lands, and they also paid in kind with things like farm equipment, rations, flour, lard, stuff like that, livestock, and this compensation for taking the land was often a payment in something that was intended to make them more like white Americans. Right? So we'll read about that. So what? What's it matter? Well, I want you to think about these things as you're reading. Okay, so these are some points you might kind of consider as you're reading Dispossession of the Pawnee and as well as the text chapter. Think about the payments. Could payments have been made in cash or in money that could be invested, perhaps in Eastern banks or in sort of trust funds that could support a traditional way of life? Be thinking about be paying attention to what happens to this compensation or the type of compensation that's received, and then think about any possible alternatives you might as you're reading this. So I'll move on past this slide. The last point here, though, is the question is, why did the Indians put up with this sort of thing? And there are a lot of explanations for that. One that you'll probably get a sense of is kind of expressed in the reading. It refers to what some may refer to as dependency theory. Dependency theory. That's an idea that states or countries or governments will tend to get what they want by developing relationships that sort of pull people into their system. Okay? And that sort of relates to this dependency idea that trade is sort of one part of developing a dependency on a larger state. Okay, well, that's getting a little too abstract for my taste. So let's kind of finish up here with talking about one of the greatest scholars, historian, on the Great Plains. In fact, guess what? He's got a book called The Great Plains. Right? This was the late Walter Prescott Webb. He was actually a cowboy raised in Texas, and went to college at a later part in life. He got started late as an academic, but he kind of went through real quick and became very well known for big ideas. So in geography, we tend to think of Walter Prescott Webb as pretty significant in a lot of ways, but we also tend to think of him as an environmental determinist. Okay, I'll try to qualify what I say about him is that, and actually he was probably what you could. It probably wouldn't be too much of a stretch to say that he was an unapologetic environmental determinist. All right. So just to remind you, remember, environmental determinism refers to the idea that the environment shapes culture. Environment pretty much lays out what's going to happen in the future. Okay? So environmental determinism not only shapes what people do and how they think, but perhaps the consequences of of their existence over time. So it kind of shapes the pattern of events. All right. So what did Walter Prescott do? Well, he was influenced a lot by a famous historian at the University of Wisconsin by the name of Frederick what? Frederick what? History majors. Frederick Jackson starts with a T. Frederick Jackson Thompson? Frederick Jackson what?
Turner.
Yeah, exactly. Here you go. Frederick Jackson Turner. Frederick Jackson Turner in 1893 wrote his famous paper about the significance of the frontier in American history. And the idea was that in 1893, after the census of 1890, the census of 1890 was real significant because in the Census Bureau after 1890 said that the frontier is now gone. The frontier has closed. And so what Turner was saying was that American history no longer has a frontier, folks. And that's what made Americans Americans, was the frontier. So if we don't have a frontier anymore, what are we going to do? We've got to start thinking differently. Anyway, so that was the Turnerian ideas, were associated with advancing westward, with the idea that American character was largely shaped by this individualistic, rugged, what do we call
it? Individualism.
Yeah, sort of self-reliant, rugged individualism, where we were different from the Europeans because we confronted the environment one. All right, so that was the idea, or something like that. That we were, that our national character or our culture was largely based on a confrontation with the wilderness, with natural, challenges, and indigenous peoples who didn't want us to take their land, right? And other empires, perhaps, like the Spanish Empire, that had the land and took it. But these were some of the big ideas of, and it had a lot to do with things like that we've kind of alluded to earlier in the course. Things like the public land survey system, which neatly spread American farmers out on the land, dispersing them, but yet allowing them to have a bit of a community, and that community was the basis of stable democracy, right? So those are some of the ideas that Turner pushed, the Turnerian sort of approach or influences. And so Webb was influenced by Turner, but Webb also knew that the Great Plains was different, and he had a number of ideas that we ought to recognize, we ought to pay attention to, and at least think about. So he says that the Great Plains is really a matter of lack of water, but also a scarcity of timber and very level terrain. So the Great Plains to him began about the 98th meridian. The 98th, where are we in Stillwater? What meridian are we on? We're east of the Indian Meridian, which, well, that's not even a line of longitude. It's we are pretty much between 96 and 97 degrees west longitude. So the 98th meridian is out about Highway 81. If you drive out to Hennessy, okay, you get out to about somewhere, I guess, between maybe Hennessy and O'Keene, all right, you're hitting about the 98th meridian. So western Oklahoma would be Great Plains in this case. And what he's saying about that magical meridian was that, it's about analogous to the 30-inch rainfall line, something like that. Here in Stillwater, we get about 33 inches of rain a year. So around 30 inches of rain. Less than that, it's, the land is significantly dry, and for the most part, most parts of the plains can't support forests beyond that 30-inch rainfall line, 30-inch ISO high if you're a physical geographer. Okay, so number one, the Great Plains is a distinct entity that's radically different from the humid timbered east that most Americans had experienced all the way up until that point. All right, so Americans were lucky to land, and to live for several centuries in an environment that really wasn't that different from what they had experienced in their homelands in Northwest Europe. It wasn't quite as wet. It wasn't as mild, but it certainly had lots of timber and had good farmland, this sort of thing. Number two, the Great Plains environment, this is the big one. The Plains environment forced Americans and their institutions, lifestyles, to change before it would allow them to settle it. Okay? So in other words, it says the Great Plains is different, it's distinctive, it's different. It's not a desert, but it's different than anything else. At least in a desert, you don't have water, right? So people that settle in deserts are always looking for water. The thing about the Great Plains is it can fool you. Okay, and this often happened that people would arrive in and live for a few years before drought burned them out. At least in a desert, you know what you're up against, and things are more reliable. So he says that the plains are so different that they required Americans to alter their methods, to alter their lifestyle, alter their technology before they could settle the plains. In other words, he said in a lot of ways, a lot of caricatures of this story are that Walter Prescott Webb said that just like Ian Fraser did, right? And that is that agriculture stopped and did a double take. Agriculture stopped somewhere on the 98th meridian and would not advance until something allowed it to happen, until technology. And so the Great Plains, in his book, he discusses all of these different innovations that eventually allowed settlement to expand into the Great Plains. And he starts off with, sort of the conquest side of it, right? So the horse, without, and actually, with regard to the horse, he could be referring to groups like the Plains Indians. Because where did the horse come from? Yeah, the horses, wild horses in the Great Plains were released, some people believe, around 1680 when supposedly they escaped from Santa Fe and escaped from the Spanish. And between, throughout the probably the 17th and the 18th centuries is when native peoples in the Great Lakes and the what we would today call the Middle West began to utilize horses to hunt buffalo on horseback and become truly nomadic peoples. So sedentary plains peoples or sedentary native peoples became nomadic in this brief period before the middle 19th century. So their culture flourished by the innovation of the horse. Whoops. Their culture flourished with this innovation. And then there are other things like the Colt revolver, the six-shooter, and the Winchester carbine, which allowed conquest. It allowed those with the technology to dispossess those without it. The open range cattle industry, which I'll talk about, and you'll read a little bit more about in the coming week or two. Open range cattle industry was an ecological, to a degree, ecologically it made sense, but it was also an economically sort of ideal use of the land for the land in the high plains. We'll talk about that in detail later. Things like barbed wire, okay, or if you're from Oklahoma or Texas, it's what is it? It's barbed wire. So those, that's an innovation that was invented by Glidden in 1874, and sometime around the 1880s when it was finally distributed. Much of the plains became fenced, and the open range began to die away. Other innovations included sod housing, the use of the grass itself for makeshift housing, because what was lacking? What did Americans make houses from 1,000 miles to the east, or 500 miles to the east of the Great Plains? What did settlers generally use?
Forests, timber.
Be more specific. Timber. Like what kind of timber? Logs? Yeah, of course, log cabins. But you gotta catch them too. If you don't catch it, you don't get the point. So yeah, timber, logs, or if they had railroad connections, sawn lumber. Okay, so those are important, and you don't have access to very good log timber for building. Closer to the railroads, you could eventually get sawn lumber. Right? All right. Windmills. I've got something to read on windmills, but I didn't put it on your list. So if you really want to know about windmills, I'll give you a paper on windmills. But things like dry land farming, you may not understand exactly what that means, but use of irrigation, all sorts of other stuff. So these are the things that sort of allowed or developed on the plains, supposedly. And that's probably enough for today.